Imagine a country with no mountains, no natural resources, constantly flooded by the sea, a place that, by all logic, should never have survived. Now imagine that same country, just a few decades later, controlling over half of the world's maritime trade, and inventing something that would permanently change how humanity thinks about money. This is not a fairy tale, this happened, and it started in a swamp. Before we dive in, I want to be upfront with you about something. Most people, when they think about the history of finance, they think about Wall Street. They think about New York, London, maybe ancient Rome. They picture big empires with vast armies and enormous natural wealth. But here's what almost nobody talks about. The most important financial revolution in human history didn't happen in a powerful empire. It happened in a tiny, waterlogged corner of northern Europe, a place that was literally fighting for its right to exist. And the reason that matters to you, right now, in the 21st century, is this. Every time you buy a stock, invest in an index fund, or even open a brokerage account, you are using a system that was designed by Dutch merchants over 400 years ago. The concepts they invented, shared ownership, transferable shares, publicly traded companies, those aren't just history. They are the architecture of the financial world you live in today. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand not just what the stock market is, but why it exists, why it had to be invented, and who the people were that made it happen. And trust me, once you understand the origin, the whole system starts to make a lot more sense. Let's go back to the beginning. The year is around 1550, and the region we now call the Netherlands is not a country. Not yet. It's a collection of provinces under the control of the Spanish Empire, at that time the most powerful empire in the world. Spain controlled vast territories across Europe, South America, and beyond. The Dutch, by comparison, were nobodies. But they had one thing going for them. They were stubborn, extraordinarily stubborn. The land itself demanded it. A huge portion of what is now the Netherlands sits below sea level. We're not talking about low-lying areas that occasionally flood. We're talking about land that would simply not exist without constant human intervention. For centuries, the Dutch had been building an elaborate system of dikes, canals, and windmill-powered pumps, essentially waging a permanent war against the ocean to keep their farmland from disappearing underwater. Think about what that does to a culture over generations. When you live in a place where nature itself is trying to erase you, you develop certain values, you become practical, you become collaborative, because no single family can build a dike alone. You become extremely efficient with resources because you simply can't afford to waste anything. And then, in 1568, things got even harder. The Dutch provinces launched what would become an 80-year war for independence against Spain. 80 years. Multiple generations of people who were born, lived their entire lives, and died, still at war. During this conflict, Spain made a devastating strategic decision. They blockaded the port of Antwerp, which at that time was the commercial capital of northern Europe. Thousands of merchants, artisans, skilled workers, and crucially, Jewish traders who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal, all flooded northward into the Dutch provinces. And most of them ended up in Amsterdam. At this moment, Amsterdam was a mid-sized trading town, built on a swamp, at the mouth of a river. It had no particular advantages. No great harbor, no empire behind it. But it had something else. It had become a city of refugees, people who had already lost everything once and had absolutely nothing left to lose. That combination, desperate, skilled, collaborative people, with a cultural backbone forged by centuries of fighting the sea, was about to become the most powerful economic force the world had ever seen. Now, to really understand what happened next, we need to talk about something that most finance videos skip entirely: culture. Because the Dutch economic miracle wasn't just about geography or timing, it was about a very specific set of values that shaped how people thought about money, work, and success. And those values came, in large part, from a religious movement called Calvinism. John Calvin was a French theologian whose ideas spread rapidly through northern Europe in the 16th century, and his theology had some very unusual economic implications. Calvin taught that wealth, in itself, was not sinful, but idleness was. Wasting time was a moral failure. Spending your money on luxury and display was considered almost obscene. But working hard, living simply, and reinvesting your profits, that was seen as a form of spiritual discipline. Now, contrast that with the dominant Catholic culture of Spain and Portugal at the time. When Spanish conquistadors brought enormous quantities of gold and silver back from South America, and they brought staggering amounts, what did they do with it? They built cathedrals. They funded wars. They wore it on their clothes. The wealth was consumed, displayed, and spent. The Dutch, on the other hand, had a radically different reflex. When a Dutch merchant made a profit, the cultural expectation, enforced not by law but by community values, was that you lived modestly and you put the money back to work. You didn't build a palace. You built a slightly larger warehouse. You bought another ship. You invested in your neighbor's trading venture. This created something economists call a virtuous cycle of capital accumulation. Money made money, which was reinvested to make more money, which was reinvested again, not siphoned off into luxury goods, but kept circulating in the economy. There's a fascinating detail here that I love. Amsterdam, at the peak of its power in the 1600s, was arguably the richest city in the world per capita, and yet visitors from France, Italy, and England consistently remarked on how plain everything looked. The houses were tall and narrow, not because the Dutch couldn't afford wide ones, but because property taxes were calculated by street frontage. So they built up instead of out. Efficient, practical, frugal. Even the wealthiest merchants wore simple dark clothing. Public displays of wealth were considered slightly embarrassing, almost vulgar. And this matters enormously for what comes next. Because when you have a culture that consistently reinvests rather than consumes, capital accumulates. And when capital accumulates, people start looking for bigger and bigger things to invest in. By the late 1500s, Amsterdam's merchants were sitting on significant pools of capital, and they had their eyes on something almost impossibly ambitious. By the 1590s, Dutch merchants had realized something important. The real money wasn't in European trade. The real money was in the spice trade with Asia. Spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon were extraordinarily valuable in Europe, not just for flavoring food, but for preserving it, for medicine, for perfume. A small sack of nutmeg could be worth more than a laborer's yearly salary. The problem was that the Portuguese had largely monopolized the spice trade through their routes around Africa to India and Southeast Asia. And then Spain, allied with Portugal, cut Dutch merchants off from those routes entirely. So the Dutch decided to do what stubborn, desperate people do. They found another way. Starting in 1595, Dutch expeditions began sailing around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. The first voyage was, let's be honest, a disaster. It took 14 months just to reach Asia. Of the 249 men who left, only 87 came back. The profit on that first voyage was essentially zero. But here's the thing about merchants who grew up fighting the sea. They didn't quit. They sent a second expedition, and a third. And this is where the financial problem became crystal clear. Each of these voyages required enormous upfront investment. You needed ships, which were extraordinarily expensive. You needed crews, which meant paying wages for a year or two before any return. You needed cargo, provisions, weapons for protection, navigational instruments. And then, and this is the part that's easy to overlook, there was the risk. Ships sank, pirates attacked, crews died of disease, cargo spoiled, foreign rulers confiscated goods, wars broke out mid-voyage. The expected return on a successful voyage was spectacular, sometimes 400%, 500%, even more. But the probability of a ship simply not coming back at all was significant. Somewhere between 30% and 50% of ships that set out on these long voyages never returned. So think about the math. If you put all your money into one ship and that ship sinks, you lose everything. Your family is ruined. Your business is gone. This meant that only the wealthiest individual merchants could afford to participate in the spice trade. And even they were taking on terrifying personal risk. There were some limited partnerships being used, small groups of investors pooling resources for a single voyage. But each voyage was a separate deal. When the ship came back, the partnership dissolved, profits were divided, and you started over from scratch. It was inefficient. It was fragile. And it meant that Dutch trading ventures were constantly competing with each other, sometimes undercutting each other's prices in Asian markets, driving down profits for everyone. Something needed to change. Someone needed to think bigger. And in 1602, they did. In 1602, the Dutch government, the States General, did something that had never been done before in quite this way. They brought together all the competing Dutch trading companies that were operating in Asia and merged them into a single entity. They called it the Verenigd Oost-Indische Compagnie, which in English we know as the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a government-backed monopoly. And it was. The VOC had exclusive rights to Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan, essentially the entire Asian market. But the truly revolutionary part wasn't the monopoly. It was the financial structure. The VOC was designed as what we now call a joint stock company with a crucial twist that had never been done before. The company would be permanent. Let me explain why that's so important. Previous trading ventures were temporary. You invested for one voyage, the ship came back, or didn't, and the whole thing was liquidated. Done. Over. The VOC, by contrast, was designed to operate indefinitely. It would own ships, warehouses, forts, and trade relationships on a permanent basis. It would hire permanent staff. It would build long-term infrastructure in Asia. And to fund this permanent operation, it needed to raise an enormous amount of capital, more than any single wealthy family or small group could provide. So the VOC issued shares. Anyone, and I mean anyone, could buy a share of the VOC. Wealthy merchants, obviously, but also craftsmen, bakers, servants, widows. For the equivalent of a few months' wages, an ordinary person could own a piece of this vast commercial enterprise. The total amount raised in the initial offering was approximately 6.4 million guilders. To put that in perspective, that was roughly 10 times the capital raised by the English East India Company, which was founded just 2 years earlier. But here's where it gets truly revolutionary. The VOC's founders realized that if they were going to ask ordinary people to invest their savings, those people needed a way to get their money out if they needed it. Remember, this was a permanent company. If your only option was to wait for the company to eventually dissolve and pay out, you might be waiting forever. So they created something else, something that would turn out to be even more important than the company itself. They created a secondary market, a place where you could sell your VOC shares to someone else, without the company needing to do anything. If you needed cash, you found a buyer, agreed on a price, and transferred the share. That secondary market needed a physical location, a place where buyers and sellers could find each other, negotiate prices, and conduct transactions. And in 1602, the same year the VOC was founded, that location was established on a bridge in Amsterdam. It was the world's first stock exchange. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, or Boers, as the Dutch called it, started, quite literally, on a bridge over one of the city's canals. Merchants would gather there at fixed times, buyers and sellers would find each other, and prices for VOC shares would fluctuate based on supply and demand. Within a few years, a proper building was constructed, the first building in history specifically designed for trading financial securities. And what happened inside that building was extraordinary. Within just a few decades, the Amsterdam Boers developed virtually every financial instrument and practice that we still use today. Let's go through some of them, because this is where it gets genuinely mind-blowing. Short selling. Traders in Amsterdam figured out that you could profit from a falling price, not just a rising one. You could borrow shares from someone, sell them immediately, wait for the price to drop, buy them back cheaper, return the shares, and pocket the difference. The Dutch government tried to ban short selling multiple times. It didn't work. The practice was too profitable, and eventually it became accepted as a permanent feature of markets. Amsterdam traders invented contracts that gave you the right, but not the obligation, to buy or sell shares at a specific price in the future. This allowed merchants to lock in prices for goods that hadn't been delivered yet, managing their risk across time. Think about that, derivatives trading, something that modern finance geeks treat as incredibly sophisticated, invented in 17th century Amsterdam. Margin trading. You could buy shares using borrowed money, leveraging your position to amplify potential gains. Extremely risky then as now, but the mechanism was invented there. Market manipulation, and the first attempts to regulate it. Almost immediately, people began trying to manipulate the market, spreading false rumors, coordinating trades to move prices artificially, and almost immediately, regulators began trying to stop them. It's a story that sounds remarkably familiar. Leggero Sorriso, no Tom DeVos. There's a remarkable document from this era, a book written in 1688 by a Jewish Dutch trader named Joseph de la Vega called Confusion de Confusiones. It's the oldest surviving book written about stock market trading, and when you read it, the thing that strikes you is how modern it sounds. De la Vega describes market euphoria, panic selling, the psychology of crowds, the difference between long-term investors and short-term speculators. 400 years later, every single one of those dynamics is still present in every financial market in the world. Pause. But let's zoom out for a moment and think about what this really represented. Before the Amsterdam stock market, investment in large enterprises was essentially limited to the very wealthy and the very powerful. Kings financed wars, Rich merchants financed trading voyages. Ordinary people had no meaningful way to participate in large-scale economic ventures. The stock market changed that. For the first time in history, a baker's widow in Amsterdam could own a piece of a company trading pepper in Java. A carpenter could share in the profits of a voyage to Japan. This democratization of investment, imperfect as it was genuinely new in the world. And the company at the center of it all, the VOC, became almost incomprehensibly large and powerful. At its peak, the VOC employed over 50,000 people. It had its own army and navy. It could wage war, sign treaties, and establish colonies. Its market capitalization, adjusted for inflation, was somewhere in the range of $8 trillion in today's money, larger than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and every other major company combined. All of this from a swamp. By the mid-1700s, Dutch financial dominance began to fade. Wars, overextension, and rising competition from Britain gradually eroded the VOC's position. The company was dissolved in 1799. But here's the thing about truly revolutionary ideas. They don't disappear when the people who invented them decline. The British didn't replace Dutch finance, they adopted it, improved it, scaled it. When William of Orange became King of England in 1688, in what's known as the Glorious Revolution, he brought Dutch financial expertise with him. Dutch financiers helped establish the Bank of England in 1694. Dutch concepts of public debt, central banking, and share trading were transplanted into the English system. And from Britain, these ideas migrated to its colonies, including a small collection of states along the eastern seaboard of North America, where, in 1792, merchants began trading securities under a buttonwood tree on a street called Wall Street. Every major financial market in the world today, New York, London, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Frankfurt, is a direct descendant of the Amsterdam Boers. The concepts are the same. Publicly traded companies with transferable shares, secondary markets where those shares can be bought and sold, price discovery through supply and demand, financial instruments for managing risk across time. The vocabulary is even the same in many cases. Words like stock and broker and market entered the English language largely through Dutch influence in this period. And perhaps most importantly, the idea, the foundational belief that ordinary people should be able to invest in and benefit from large economic enterprises. That idea has shaped the entire trajectory of modern capitalism. The Dutch proved something that had never been proven before, that you didn't need kings and empires to build world-changing enterprises. You just needed a system that could aggregate the small savings of many ordinary people and direct them toward ambitious goals. That insight is the bedrock of modern finance. So let's bring this home. A country that shouldn't have existed. A culture built on sobriety, collaboration, and the relentless reinvestment of profits. A group of merchants who faced an impossible problem and invented an entirely new solution. The Dutch didn't set out to create modern finance. They set out to trade pepper and nutmeg, but in solving their immediate problem, how do we share the risk and reward of these enormously expensive voyages? They accidentally built the architecture of the financial world we all live in today. Here's what I want you to take away from this. First, the stock market is not some mysterious, abstract machine invented by Wall Street bankers. It's a 400-year-old Dutch solution to a very human problem. How do you pool resources to do things that no single person can do alone? Second, culture shapes finance. The Dutch model worked not just because of clever financial engineering, but because it was embedded in a culture that valued discipline, reinvestment, and long-term thinking. That's a lesson that's still relevant every time you make a financial decision. And third, the most important financial innovations in history weren't invented by the richest or most powerful people. They were invented by people with their backs against the wall who had no other option but to think differently. If you found this valuable, and I genuinely hope you did, please hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep dive content is worth sharing, and it helps this channel grow. If you want to understand more about how the financial systems that shape your life were actually built, subscribe, because we're going to keep going deeper. And if you have a question, or if there's a financial topic or historical moment you want me to cover, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, keep thinking long term.